Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are in the world joining us for this British Academy of Management webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Stefan Stern. I'm going to be chairing this discussion on staying active and connected in research during the COVID-19 crisis. We've got three excellent speakers and a proper international reflection today of this international global problem. Joining us from Palermo, Sicily, we have Professor Arabella Mocciaro. She's Professor of Management there. Good to see you. Also on the board of the Società Italiana de Management, which is a partner of the British Academy of Management, our host today. From Warwick, Professor Graham Curry. He's the Pro-Dean of Research and Innovation at Warwick Business School. We'll hear some practical examples and questions from him about this question of keeping research going. And from Lancaster in the beautiful northwest of England, we have Professor Katie Mason, who's also, among other things, chair of the British Academy of Management, but her day job, as it were, is to be Director of Research Enhancement at Lancaster University. So here we are. Thank you for joining us. Wired for sound, literally in my case. This is our life at the moment, remote, online, staring at screens for hours and hours, staring at screens for even longer than perhaps we are used to doing, cut off from our colleagues and from each other, from libraries, the offline world that many of us still actually enjoy working in. How can we cope? How can academics and researchers and scholars keep vibrant, energetic, energized at a time like this? We're going to have some thoughts from our panel. I'm going to invite Arabella to start us off, and then we'll hear from the others, and there'll be some time for questions. Please do send them in via the software that I'm sure you're used to. But Arabella, over to you, please.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to BAM and to Katie, all of you, for inviting the Italian Society of Management to the conversation. We're absolutely thrilled to be invited here to this webinar. So I'd say that before we go into how to do research, how to keep vibrant in this moment, one point to start off with is exactly what kind of problem are we facing? How can we frame this problem? And I've heard so many different ways of framing it, you know, like an interruption, a game changer, a wild card, a revolution, or a learning experience, all different terms that try to bring to the mind, I think, a sense of urgency and the impact and uncertainty around this period. And yet there are some specificities that I would underscore. And one is that it comes from a virus. It's coming from the medical and a health issue. And the second is that it's infringing on, as you just were saying, how each one of us connect to objects, to material and immaterial things, the way we carry out our routines, the relationships. It's actually changing the very mechanisms at the basics of societies and economies and organizations. And that's not just happening in a few nations, that's happening globally. I mean, it's more than 185 nations now. So I think that this really poses it as a grand challenge. And what do we intend by a grand challenge? A grand challenge has as a distinctive characteristic that it crosses disciplinary boundaries. There are barriers that have a huge impact on people and organizations worldwide, that are complex, multi-level problems, but that do have a solution. They do have a way of being solved at some point, and that solution will require technical and social aspects. And I think that if we as management scholars want to maintain our legitimacy in society, society requires from us an empirically sound basic basis on which to give advice to leaders in organizations, in nations, on the actions to be taken in this period. But I'd say that the actions on the advice they want are both for the brief period in this COVID emergency, and on the other hand, a longer term advice on how to give structures and economies resilience and nimbleness in time in front of other pandemics and or possible menaces. And so this kind of problem has ways of going about researching it. It tends to be a research that must be interdisciplinary. It must be bringing into the conversation more different, different types of stakeholders. It must be collaborative. It has to have very impactful and practical. In the rigor relevance, it has to have a strong relevance, and it needs to be touching both technical and social aspects. So they'll need, for us to engage in the political conversation in order to actually help the implementation of these problems. I think that, as I said, the way you do research and the object of research will really change if we look at the short-term problem of how to, take away this or manage this COVID experience now, and a longer-term aspect of resilience and structural changes to the system in the long term. And that will require different types of research, different types of way of communicating research.
Thank you. So a big picture. The challenge couldn't actually be bigger in a way when you describe it in that way. Thank you, Arabella. I'll move on to Graham before we get our discussion going. Graham, do
yeah. I mean, what I want to do is ground what Arabella said, really around two issues. I mean, one is the complexity of any research that's required. It needs to be interdisciplinary, and it needs to be in partnership with policy and practitioner stakeholders. And the other issue she raised was about the legitimacy of business schools. That if we are to ensure a legitimacy in the long term, then we need to engender economic and social value through a research. And I suppose, you've got to think about, well, what does that mean for business schools in terms of the topics we deal with? And I'm going to illustrate it from examples from Warwick Business School, but I'm hopeful that all business schools will be following similar lines. So I've identified 7 areas, or 8 areas, in fact, in which business school research can do something of value. And there is research funding around for this. The recent call from UCRI, for example, to address COVID. So it seems that of business school disciplines, the one that the policymakers probably most listening to at the moment are behavioural science. So we've got behavioural scientists, for example, working with their economics department, so in an interdisciplinary way, as suggested by Arabella, to understand how the population behaves when faced with lockdown, around social distancing, for example. So Nick Chater's been in the press about that, but then also talking about post-lockdown strategies, and that's been pretty controversial. What our behavioural scientists have been advising the Cabinet Office, for example, releasing 20 to 30-year-olds from lockdown to start with, something as a 58-year-old who wants to go fly fishing, I'm not very happy with. But interestingly, I think Arabella said as well, we have to be on the political scene and working with the relevant agencies in this. So our behavioural scientists have been working through NHS England, the Behavioural Insights team, and the Cabinet Office to inform government strategy. And it's important we get into those spaces. There's not just the health implications, but there's a dual imperative of the health and economic implications. So, we've got to think about what are the implications for the economy, particularly, for example, needs. So Stephen Roper and Nigel Driffield in our ESRC funded Enterprise Research Centre are collaborating with BIS. Again, they're getting into that policy making space to ascertain the effect upon COVID-19, looking at the dissolution of SMEs as well as their incorporation. There's obviously an ISM agenda here, information systems management, specifically around digital health innovation, which we've seen accelerate in the context of COVID. So we've got researchers looking at, for example, virtual clinics and self-management, and including the use of tracking apps for COVID-19. In my area, organisation studies, we've got people like Davide Nicolini looking at managing virtual teams. We're all have to get used to that. There's obviously a whole public management agenda. I think in particular, collaboration with medical schools. So, for example, myself and colleagues are writing articles for the British Medical Journal and Public Administration Review at the moment. I'm around systems level leadership to address COVID-19. There's an HRM, a human resource management agenda. So we've got academics like Kim Hawk, who, for example, are looking at the unequal effects of COVID-19 upon employment. And we're working with government department and an MP indeed to assess the effect upon disabled people. Penultimately, there's an operations management agenda. You know, hospitals have to respond to it, not just to COVID, but then increasingly they're going to need to keep mainstream clinical care going. So how do they do that? For example, using systematic quality improvement methods. And we're working with NHS England and the Health Foundation regarding that. And finally, as I've alluded to earlier, we're seeing innovation accelerating, particularly in healthcare, not just around digital intervention, but around work practices. And working with the medical school, we put in place a learnings and change template to be filled in by clinicians and managers at hospitals in general, but in particular, this was aimed at the big London Nightingale Hospital. Now, that's just a sort of smorgasbord of research opportunities that we might have. There's research funding around for this recently from UCRI. It is going to mean we have to work in different ways. We're going to have to work quickly. We're going to have to make sure that practical lessons are foregrounded, and we're going to need to work dirtily. And we need to get these lessons out before the anticipated second wave of COVID arises. And finally, I also highlight the need to get our research out there. We need to reach out to relevant government agencies, you know, NHS England Improvement, Behavioural Insights Team, Department for Business Innovation and Skills. I would argue we should be represented on some of the committees, such as SAGE. We know there's supply chain problems, we know there's operational problems. Why aren't we there? And we need to be prepared to write more journalistic pieces for relevant needs and their audiences. So I think that's my suggestion, how practically we play into this agenda. And I'll hand over to Katie.
Thank you, Graham. And just quickly, a couple of other Warwick names that come up. Obviously, Andrew Oswald, we see a lot on the behavioural side. And Gus O'Donnell, Lord O'Donnell, who is, I believe, an alumnus and a Warwick economist.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to draw on your alumni here, you know, to get folks into the government departments. And certainly Gus has been very helpful in that matter for us regarding our entry into Cabinet Office.
Yeah, he knows the combination to the locks and so on. Katie, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Stefan. So I guess there's 2 points I want to make related to this notion of COVID as a grand challenge and a game changer, and also related to the types of projects that relate to the social science that goes on in business and management studies, which Graham's just been talking about. So I guess the first thing is that COVID is a university and research landscape game changer in the UK and internationally. And so we, as the British Academy of Management, need to work really closely with our key stakeholders to ensure that business and management research is accessible and is informing policy. I think Graham's absolutely on the button on that. It's critical that we are thinking about what we can do to be part of this socio-economic recovery that we now seriously have to engage with. That means we need to collaborate with practitioners and professional bodies in new ways. And we also need to act as an amplifier, certainly as a learned society, for their concerns and needs. Those concerns and needs are emerging right now, real time. And we need to have our ears open to listen to that and work out how we can better support our members with engaging with those emerging agendas. And I think also that means that we need to do it in a collaborative and interdisciplinary way, working across boundaries, creating comparative studies, understanding the nature of culture and situated practice that helps us really solve real-time regional problems of the different businesses in different areas across the UK and internationally. Second, that means we need to think about what we do as individual researchers. So that agenda will change slightly. There's huge pressures on faculty at the moment as we move an entire academic year online into a new digital world, and we start to experiment with social distancing and new ways of doing blended learning. This is a huge learning curve for everybody, but it's not an inconvenient spike. It's a transformation in the way we will work from now on forever. And I think that means we need to think about how we engage with our new research routines and what we learn as we go through this process.
Thank you, Katie. Well, Graham was talking about the need for journalistic output. In my terms, you buried the big story till the end there about this not being a momentary, a temporary experience, but a transformation. And people had better get used to working rather more like this in the future. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about that at this point.
Yeah, so I think we have traditionally worked in quite often with qualitative research in face-to-face contexts. So we are visiting people in their organizations, we're being in communities of people and observing their working practices, and we're really getting deeply engaged with their everyday work. That everyday work is transforming for them now as they work from home more and more, and they have new practices to engage with to ensure people's safety and security in the workplace. Those changes are quite expensive to institute, so sometimes it means new equipment, new materials, new factory arrangements, new retail arrangements. We've all experienced that as we walk around Sainsbury's socially distant 2 trolleys apart. And so those aren't just going to vanish in a moment. Those material changes are there to stay, and some of the social practices will all be transformed in that process. So understanding what that means for the way we work, both individually and collectively, will be a big takeout. I think if you think about the transformation even in the retail sector, where we went and we queued up at a shop and we took a list and we didn't touch the goods behind the counter pre-war, we told them what we wanted and we had them prepared for us. That was a major change. When we had the big retail store, we had the shopping trolley that allowed us to calculate differently what it was we bought. We put things in the trolley differently. And so instead of calculating on price, we calculated by what the trolley could hold. And so we bought differently. And so now we're going through another one of those material changes. And that is true for retailing, it's true for production, it's true for all sorts of knowledge work, consultancy, international travel. And so it's up to our community to start to make sense of that and help organizations transition into that. And that means that our researchers need to think really carefully, not only about listening better, but providing insights that are real time and simple and achievable actions. So rather than being grounded in the complicated theoretical arguments that are really important for helping us see these new insights, we need to lose some of that baggage and be able to communicate clearly, this is what you need to do. And
an immediate reaction is obviously ethnographic research and studies completely changed. The quality of the access you're going to have and the time you're going to spend with people, you're going to have to be distanced. And yes.
So one of the challenges I'm having in a very specific project at the moment is I'm working on a 5G installation project with a number of companies. And we're trying to put digital connectivity into all sorts of different communities. One of the communities we're working with is in North Yorkshire. So there's huge areas of North Yorkshire because of the hills, because of the landscape, that actually have no mobile connectivity, no broadband, etc., etc. So they're excluded from all this home working and digital connectivity, giving patient care safely through IT technologies, because you're not bringing people into surgeries around sick people, all those things that they are excluded from. And so trying to do the ethnographic research that helps us put the right networks in the right places and work out what the social economic impact is without being able to use the IT to facilitate that is really, really difficult. So we are facing new challenges that we've not faced before.
Arabella, did you want to come in at this point, some of these practical questions to respond to the big challenge you described so nicely?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. One thing I wanted to say is just how, you know, as learned societies, as academies, we can play or help to play to our academic community in this. And I think there are 2 points, and one is precisely what the other people, what Graeme and Katie were playing to the, you know, the time is key. You need to give rapid answers in this, and to follow these changes in a, say, dirty but timely way. And I think that academies can help and support that by giving occasions to researchers to expose that and pushing them towards thinking about issues of the sort. So not only engaging in the political discourse as an academy, but also, you know, opening up conference datelines in order to call for papers that are rapid, that are picking up best practices, picking up what's working in the society in this moment and diffusing it rapidly. But we're seeing it also in journals. I mean, there have been call for papers in academic journals that are saying, you know, for the 15th of May, bring out best practices, bring out cases that are interesting, that are empirically founded, even though you haven't had the time to have a long theoretical paper and elaboration of it, but do bring it out now. So, so they're, you know, loosening the tight three rounds of review and so on to give voice to timely research. And I think that's one issue that's extremely, you know, important about picking up best practices and diffusing it, and using not only that, but also journals, blogs, easy language to make this conversation, you know, make people part of this conversation. And I think that's very important. But there is a structural point, and I think that that is a question of, you know, more structured, interdisciplinary, long-term research that needs large funding, that needs mega projects, that needs relationship between nations, between disciplines, and a longer term of research. And their academies, I think, need to bring the bridges between different disciplines, between different, you know, cohorts of researchers in different areas, in order to create the relational channels through which the members in those societies can actually connect and create more elaborate projects that will be, you know, a more rigorous, a more time-consuming issue that then gives, you know, results in a longer term.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So we're at a very interesting moment. To generalize, what I've been hearing from business schools sometimes is the frustration that journals in particular seem, I'm being very unfair in general here, but they've seemed to have wanted these vast data sets. You know, this emphasis on huge quantitative data sets to justify publication, and those who were frustrated at having much smaller qualitative samples, but with something really interesting to say, thing a bit, you know, a smaller set of data hasn't cut the mustard somehow, as we say, hasn't been good enough. Am I right to characterize in that way, or is that too sweeping? Perhaps Graeme, you could help me with a response there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree with what you say. I think particularly the US journals like big data sets, and sometimes they have a preference for quantitative data sets, depending on the journal you're aiming at. But even with qualitative data sets, they do prefer a larger data set that could be longitudinal, that could have a lot of observation as well as research interviews. And frankly, I don't see why that should go away, in my opinion. I think it's more robust research. I think the issue for me is follows, and we do see journals tending more towards this way, including the real world elite journals, such as the Academy of Management Journal. Whilst theory development is somewhat ironically privileged in the business and management world to get into the top journals, increasingly we're seeing those top journals concerned with the social and economic impact of research. So increasingly they're asking us, even before COVID-19, to deal with issues of significance for society. And I think the COVID-19 crisis will accelerate that field. And certainly at Warwick Business School, whilst there's people who are knowledge generators in a blue skies way, and I really appreciate that, they're very clever people. I think for a lot of us, that we really need to reflect upon what the value of our research is beyond that theoretical contribution. And I ask myself, and I ask our faculty as Pro Dean Research, going, tell me what the value of your research is. what's the bottom line, what difference it's making. And I think we're going to need to more attend to those issues.
That's very interesting. And you've two of you have both used the word, in quotation marks, dirty, in terms of quicker, perhaps smaller data sets. And Katie, in your job title, you have research enhancement. So is there a tension here or a trade-off to be managed between speed while maintaining the sort of the kind of rigor and disciplines that you all live and breathe the rest of the time?
Yeah, so that is it's a wonderful question. I feel really uncomfortable using the term dirty, although I understand why Graham and Arabella use it. My experience of working on Innovate UK related projects, where you've got lots of practitioners who aren't researcher trained, has helped me learn to try and tread a very careful line between the integrity of research, the ethics that are in place, the speed at which things change, the lack of control as a researcher if you have of anything, and the pace at which, you know, these big investments from governments demand that we act. You know, there's millions of pounds going into these types of projects, and they really matter. They really make a difference to the number of jobs, the skills and capabilities that the UK has, certainly from our government investment. And I know you know, Germany and China are way ahead of the UK on their investments in those areas. So there is a lot that we need to learn as researchers to be more nimble. I think it's not so much dirty, but being less hung up about waiting till we finish the research to share early insights, and helping us talk in a less theoretical way and more practical way to share insights early, with the provision that the research is ongoing. And I think if we can get more confident with a dialectic with practitioners and policymakers, and create more forums where those conversations can happen easily without blaming people for having wrong insights or whatever, you know, it needs to be that comfortable space, and it's our collective responsibility to work towards creating that. And I think Arabella is absolutely right. Our Learning Society could play a big role in helping researchers from all our universities come together to have those sorts of conversations with people that have actually usually been excluded from learning societies, like practitioners and policymakers. And, you know, BAM has reached out and is working with the Cabinet Office Open Innovation team to try and point the right people in the right direction when they have specific problems that they're trying to unpack in government.
Well, that's excellent. I would put in a quick plug for The Conversation, which you may be familiar with, as a place where it's a safe place, if you like, I think, for academics to think out loud and share initial findings in a journalistic, you know, 800-word, 1,000-word format. And it's not, you know, it's not a peer-reviewed paper or anything, but it's somewhere where you can ventilate and amplify ideas in a useful way. I should also give you a journalist's health warning, because, as you know, in my trade, we say that two anecdotes is a trend and 3 are data, and I don't suppose no one's going to get quite as dirty with quotes or otherwise as that. So, you know, beware. And we say, of course, we see in the British press, at least at any rate, we see on the front pages what happens, unfortunately, sometimes when researchers and scholars share initial tentative findings with a news reporter, and the results are not always pretty, I'm afraid.
I think that's the challenge. You know, there's a difference between journalism and entertainment, and what we are trying to say to a specific community to help them do their work. I don't think there's that many practitioners, if they're trying to solve a particular managerial challenge, that would turn even to the FT to try and solve their problem. So there's some sort of missing link between pure journalism and pure academic that I think we need to, our communities could really collaborate constructively in that space, should there be time and resource, right?
Yes. Any thoughts, colleagues, on
one idea, Katie was saying, you know, the ethics of this, and I think that precisely relative to this, you know, need to communicate even initial findings, it's important from an ethical point of view that each one of us, you know, in being exposed to journalists or to non-academic environments, does set a line between what is based on even initial but empirical findings and research, respect to what is their opinion, or which can also not be entirely based on research, more of a feeling or something that they are more or less, you know, it's their opinion. And I think that you need to draw a line there of what comes from research, what's empirically found, based on research, and what instead is your opinion. And that's part of being, ethics of your work, I think.
Mm-hmm. Graham.
Yeah, I mean, one of my thoughts here is, I work a lot into the clinical scientists, and they're always astounded by how long it takes to get our stuff into print. If you go for a leading European journal or a European American journal, from start to finish, it can often take 4 years. Now, in the clinical world, that's not acceptable, because if you find something that works, you need to get it out there to the audience very quickly. So I think there is something about a review process and a publication process whereby we could accelerate the things that are really important to inform, management in general, but particularly organisation and management responses to COVID. And I don't know whether we need some sort of two-tier type review process. I wouldn't want the rigor and robustness of the research to be compromised by it, but we are slowed down by the review and publication process.
In fact, Graham, I could just put one of the practical questions that's come in to you on this business of funding. Can you say a little more about where the calls are being published for research proposals and so on?
So it's ongoing funding. There's no set date on it. It's led by UCRI, but includes bodies such as the NIHR, for example, who put a broad call out for research studies to address COVID-19. It's got to be done quickly. I think they're looking for the messages to come back to them to inform a response for a potential second wave of COVID. It's not unsubstantial money. It goes right across disciplines. I think if you can do something that's practically useful as well as being academically robust, then you should go for it. Be aware that there's some guidelines that accompany it, that there's some recommendations from some of the government advisory committees about the type of issues they particularly need knowledge about to address the second wave of COVID-19 and future pandemics. So if you go onto the UCRI site, you'll be able to find details of that.
Thank you.
For example, just to give people an example, I know from Warwick Business School, we've had 2 or 3 bids going out. One about the economic effect on SMEs, and the other about how hospitals respond using systematic quality improvement measures to cope with the need to deliver COVID services and also to integrate back the mainstream services. That just gives you an example of the sorts of things you might bid for. And I think the British Academy as well has smaller, not the British Academy of Management, but the British Academy has smaller funds available for COVID research.
Yes, I think on the website there's a How to Help in COVID page if you go to the BAM website, which relates to the UCRI information you were talking about. And Graham, you touched on something else about alumni networks. What you hear anecdotally is that people do find it quite difficult sometimes to plug into the right bit of government or authority, whoever the person who's going to really pay attention. And this is where I suppose alumni could be invaluable. Yeah,
it's been interesting from, Warwick experience. We got some connections into the Cabinet Office through things like the Behavioural Insights team and the Open Innovation Unit that we've used. But I know another part, and we got connections into NHS improvement. But I know our scientists, for example, have been quite frustrated at times by not being drawn into the government efforts to develop testing materials and do the testing, etc., as well as help produce PPE type equipment. So I think when I look at systems level leadership, I think the political and scientific classes have been brought together, and increasingly some of the NHS frontline has been brought in at a senior level. But I don't think the government interacted that well with the universities, apart from select ones like Imperial, in addressing the COVID-19 crisis. And that probably particularly applies to business schools, and it's something we need to think about at a more structural level.
Arabella, in Palermo, how do you get the attention of the good people in Rome on a practical level?
So it's very difficult, but I think that, you know, you were talking about ethnographic studies, but this impact of digitalization on all kinds of organization is, of course, rendering available a huge amount of data on, you know, interactions through web pages, emails, chats. But there is I mean, that gives you the possibility maybe to access data, I suppose. There's also an issue of how you treat that data and an ethics on, you know, maintaining privacy and the correct use of that data, which I think goes back to that issue of Katie you know, the issue that Katie was saying about ethics in this period. But I think that it gives the possibility for people who are remote, like in Palermo, to have access to what's changing and what's happening in Rome and in Milan or in New Delhi, probably more than it would do in a usual period.
But I'm interested, this question of speed and pace and ethics, and I thank you for bringing that up, because there is the risk, isn't there? I should issue another health warning, that moving at pace, cutting corners, some mistakes will be made inevitably. I mean, Katie, you've touched on that. Perhaps you have some other things to say there.
So I think most university, and certainly Lancaster University, has put in huge efforts to streamline and sensibly deal with at pace COVID type research bids, right? So you have a panel of very experienced researchers looking for potential potholes that researchers could fall into or be tripped up by, and to make sure that we're doing the right thing, that we're remembering to inform people of what we're doing, that we're being inclusive in bringing citizens into the type of research that we're doing. But the big challenge with business and management is quite often a lot of the work we do involves being exposed to very commercially sensitive information. So we have to tread that line between openness and ethics and commercial responsibility, and creating Chinese walls between the participants we speak to. And in a way, it might look different, but the principles are exactly the same pre-COVID, post-COVID. In a digital world, I think we are better at thinking about digital data and the ethical clearance for digital data. What did they have? Zoom bombing, where you can appear in somebody's meeting and nobody knows you're there or where you're from, or if you're invited to the meeting. So there's all sorts of things that we're learning to deal with as we go. Research committees, because they see a lot of these things, ethics committees, then they become sensitized to them where individual researchers may not have clear sight. So I think those are the clear values of having ethics panels and ethics committees in universities. But I think recognizing that need for speed, that's not going to go away. Recognizing that organizing a whole term's teaching, and therefore I'm not researching that time, but I am researching in this time, that's gone. So our working days are stretched, our flexibility is increased. I think the current management term in the real world is we need to learn to pivot. Yes. I'm sorry to say that, but I think there's a lot of lecturers and professors learning to do exactly the same thing at the moment.
Well, I think we've seen with the bids for and the talk about possible vaccines, a lot of people talking up their chances. I mean, this obviously has implications for funding and creating a mood, and perhaps we're getting, with the help of the journalists, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves on where we might truly be on vaccines.
We could be, but we hope, right? We hope.
Yes.
And of course, there are massive organizational and distribution management issues associated with not only developing vaccines, but making choices about who gets vaccines first, where they go, and how we get that rollout, scale up, happen as fast as possible and as safely as possible.
Now, I've had another, it's a practical question has come in. Really this business of visiting offices, visiting workspaces, needing that interaction and to extract data, but nervousness about perhaps with colleagues exposing others to greater risk, research assistants and so on. Do you have any thoughts about that, managing that practically?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk to that. I've just kicked off a big ESRC funded project about transition of looked after young people into adulthood. My researchers, of which there's 5, are spread across 3 institutions. You know, the empirical context is mainly one of health and social care, perhaps education and housing. I think there's two things here. I don't think it's just the danger of getting your researcher moving around into different spaces and possibly, you know, ending up as carriers of COVID-19. But these people in public services are very busy addressing the problems caused by COVID-19. So I think we have to be very sensitive to taking up the time. At the same time, as some of us have found, no doubt, actually having an hour's break in the day, you know, to talk to someone, whether it's a journalist or whether it's a researcher who's interviewing you, as has happened a couple of times for me, has proved a welcome opportunity. So, I mean, I don't think empirical fieldwork needs to stop. I think we need to do it in a different way. We need to do it this way, virtually. And I mean, that can suit both parties. I mean, I think the distractions that you can get sometimes face to face, for example, just non-verbal communication, for example, can get in the way in, you know, eliciting the type of data you want from stakeholders. So I see my empirical fieldwork, once it's calmed down, actually being able to continue, albeit at a distance.
Thanks. Katie, you coming across a similar practical challenge of safe research?
Yeah, I think so. And what I'm finding is that with some of my participants, they're kind of transforming into data collectors, researchers themselves. So Anne Cunliffe has this beautiful notion of the researching practitioner and the practicing researcher, and actually, you know, they're two emphases of one way of being in the world, really. One being university-led and the other being practitioner-led. And I think the really nice notion of that is that you can use different ethnographic methods, ask people to keep video diaries, and that talking can be a really important part of therapy. So it's research as therapy for the people that are enrolled in it.
Yes.
Not only that, are they voicing their concerns and what they're seeing, but they're capturing real time, and that makes them reflect on, almost like beginning to step into a world of solving their own problems and reaching out to help people solve those problems. So I think there are a lot of really important aspects that we shouldn't be afraid to try and bring into people's world. I don't think we should just say, these people are really busy, we need to keep about their way. I completely agree with Graham that we need to be sensitive to the particular changes in their flow of work, etc., but still to try and engage in a way that works for them, and being sensitive to how that works for them.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there's an international fact here too, culturally. I mean, Arabella, as our non-Brit panelist, you could say that Brits might make assumptions about the rhythm of a working day in other European countries and just not understand people's preferences.
I think that the rhythm of a working day of an academic is the same in Italy as it would be in England, really. I think that's absolutely true. I'd add on to what Gravy and Katie have said, that I think this period really feeds into, gives an opportunity for research, not only to, you know, how businesses are reacting to COVID or how to overcome the COVID stress, but it's giving a natural experiment on many fronts, not only COVID related. I mean, who's studying trust in organizations has an incursion to study, you know, a scene in which we don't even know if we can trust our own relatives, or who's studying, you know, the essence of crowding or corporate reputation. There are huge, you know, huge opportunities for research, even non-COVID related to this really weird period. And this gives an occasion to open up many fields of research. I think it's a rich period.
Thank you, Arabella. That seems like a really excellent and positive and uplifting thought on which to end. I don't know where everyone else in the world is watching, but where I am, it's definitely nearly lunchtime. And at this time of the day, I do like to stop. So we're on schedule. Let's stop there. And so Katie, Graham and Arabella, thank you so much for sharing your really sharp, powerful insights into the practicalities of research in this time of COVID. Practicalities, but also the opportunities. I think we got that message very clearly from you all today. So that's some encouragement while we all sit here, shut down, locked down, working from home, cut off from each other. There'll be a conference again one day where we all meet, I'm sure. But until then, we're online and doing the best we can. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye, everybody. Thanks
Bye.
for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.